Hi, and welcome to the White House. Ellen Mauro, a reporter with CBC News, and myself, the senior Washington editor, are here to answer your questions about Robert Mueller's testimony in front of two different House committees yesterday. And the testimony happened, it was much anticipated, it was a build-up since the report came out. Everyone was waiting to see what the former special counsel would have to say. So here on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube, Ellen and I are ready to answer your questions about what you saw, about what it could mean for the president, for any potential impeachment investigations. And to start us off, Ellen, what were the highlights of what we saw?
Well, I think there were a number of things, and you can divide it by the Democratic strategy, the Republican strategy, and just Robert Mueller's appearance and how he handled it himself. The Democrats, there's an analogy going around that Democrats were betting Americans didn't read the book, but that the movie would be better.
I think I read somewhere, or heard somewhere, that it was just 3 to 5% of the American population had actually read the Mueller report. So this was supposed to be unfiltered, from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Exactly, but from the horse's mouth, there was very little that actually came out. Robert Mueller stuck to the bounds of his report, as he said he was going to do. So the Democrats, their strategy was to try to get him to highlight the points in the report that Democrats say are damaging, if not criminal, damaging for President Trump. So we heard the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, get Mueller to say and confirm that President Trump was not exonerated by the report, even though Trump himself likes to say he was totally exonerated. Democrats brought up the instances of possible obstruction of justice on the part of President Trump. They got Mueller to talk about the campaign contacts that Trump campaign officials had with Russia, even though it didn't amount to a criminal conspiracy. So their whole strategy was trying to get Mueller to talk about these difficult points for the president, and to also highlight that Mueller was bound by a Department of Justice guideline that a sitting president cannot be charged. On the other side, Republicans are really trying to discredit Mueller himself and his investigators, saying they were motivated by political bias. And Mueller, throughout the day, he wasn't particularly animated. His answers were short. It was hard to count how many times he wouldn't answer a question or referred people back to the report. But he did come alive during those questions where Republicans really sort of hammered the integrity of his investigators.
So we have a few questions coming in. Thank you so much for starting to join us. Raymond Peng is asking on Facebook, did we hear anything new? And I think the answer to that, in terms of what was laid out in the report, was no. There was a discussion of the potential instances of obstruction that was all that we knew about. We did hear, as you mentioned, from the special counsel himself that the president was not exonerated. That's also something that we knew. But I think, as you were mentioning, those comments about the ongoing efforts by Russia to interfere in upcoming elections, that really was potentially a new takeaway for people that hadn't been paying attention, right, Ellen?
For sure. Robert Mueller was asked if this was an ongoing thing, and he said, yes, they're doing it as we sit here in terms of trying to interfere in American democracy. Robert Mueller, in his opening statement yesterday morning, also talked about his long career, his decades-long career of public service here in the U.S., and he said that during that time, he's seen several serious threats towards American democracy, and he ranked the Russian election interference of 2016 as high, as one of the highest of those threats. So really underscoring how important and ongoing that situation is, particularly with another election looming in 2020. A few more questions coming in. This one on Facebook. Raiku, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Does repeatedly trying to remove the special counsel equal obstruction?
We don't know. That's the whole thing, because there was no decision made by the counsel, the special counsel's office, on the idea of obstruction. And certainly there have been other prosecutors, former prosecutors, who has looked at that evidence, that went through and laid out the incident, the potential intent, the case for potentially pursuing an obstruction case, and have said, to them it looks like obstruction, but that is not something that Robert Mueller agreed with, even though at one point it looked as though, in answer to a particular question, that he said he would have charged the president with obstruction if not for that Department of Justice ruling. He later walked that back in the second hearing. So does the attempts by the president that were laid out in the report equal obstruction of justice? The report doesn't tell us. There are lots of lawyers who think that it does, but they're not with the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice, headed by William Barr, took a look at it, said no obstruction here. So that's sort of where we're at. And what we heard from Robert Mueller didn't change that. In fact, he went out of his way to correct his statements and make it look as though not so that it wouldn't look that way, right?
And that's one of the biggest points remaining about the report is the question of obstruction of justice. There was a whole volume related to that question in the Mueller report. He listed about 10 instances of possible obstruction by the president, as you refer to in your question, Raiku, trying to interfere with the special counsel investigation. Mueller confirmed that yesterday, that the president tried to interfere with the investigation, things like trying to fire special counsel Robert Mueller, as you said. Interestingly, in the Mueller report itself, it says the president did try to interfere with the investigation, but he was unsuccessful in doing it because people did not follow his orders. So he was protected by people he was trying, according to the report, to do things to undermine the investigation. And just to talk about this issue of why a sitting president can't be charged with the crime, because that's something that's sort of been all over the place in this story. And if you hear it, it doesn't necessarily make sense. The president is not above the law. But there are several legal opinions from the Office of Legal Counsel that outline why this is a guideline. And they essentially boil down to the fact that if a sitting president is charged with a crime, then he can't exercise his duties in office, and he also can't defend himself. But that remains another confusing point of all this.
And the idea then is, well, why would you have an investigation in the first place if the president can't be charged with a crime? Why go through all this process? And the reasons that are in the report and that we heard again yesterday are that what you want to do when these kinds of accusations are out there is to go through, do the interviews and pursue the evidence, as well as to look at what peripherally may happen in terms of charges around people, around the president, which we did see in terms of Michael Flynn being charged, in terms of the Cohen case spinning out of it. But that is what leading to this additional question from Cheryl Leask, who's writing to us on Facebook. Will Donald Trump be charged when he leaves office? And I mean, it's purely speculative. The door is open. Robert Mueller answered the question that is a possibility, but that would be up to the Department of Justice at the time.
And it could also depend on whether or not President Trump wins the election in 2020, because if he does, the statute of limitations for the potential of those crimes, I believe, is 5 years. So if he wins another term, that would be longer than 5 years. So it's possible that he might not be on that basis alone. But again, that's all, as Lyndsay said, quite speculative.
Let's go back to Carolyn's question. Carolyn Breyer from Facebook, earlier in this Facebook Live, you asked us about, is the Mueller report still redacted to death? And I wish I brought my report with me, actually. I left it at the office. It is redacted. I think to death is a bit of an exaggeration. There's a couple of reasons why the material does not appear in the report. Some of it is harm to ongoing matter. That is, other court cases that spilled out of this, they don't want to limit those cases or make that information public that could potentially harm it. Some of it is personal information about people who aren't charged. You don't want to get that information out there. And the other reason is because grand jury material, I think I'm missing another one,
Sources and methods.
Sources and methods would reveal the sources and methods that are being used. So an investigative technique, for example, if you're talking about how you gather information, you don't want to put that in the report because that might tip off people that you don't want to know about how you go about getting your intelligence. On the issue of the grand jury material, that's where there was another interesting development yesterday, though, because in their response to this, when the Democrats came out and everyone's asking, what next? When you've had this hearing, did we hear anything to move the bar closer to impeachment? we didn't hear the Democrats coming out and saying, yes, this is enough. It's been a grandstand moment. The public opinion has changed. We need to go further. Instead, what we heard them say is we're going to continue to take investigative steps. And there were two particular investigative steps that they took trying to keep this story, this pressure on the administration. One of them is to legally subpoena Don McGahn, former White House counsel, who features in a couple of those instances of alleged obstruction of justice. So far, the White House has resisted McGahn testifying. Going the subpoena route would mean that there is likely a prolonged legal fight to get that testimony in front of Congress. But the other thing they said they're going to do is move towards a legal process to get their hands on some of that redacted material that you raised, and that is the grand jury material, which is usually secret, but there can be exceptions. And so what is going to happen with the Democrats is they're going to try and get their hands on that material to know what the supporting material is. What that will do is set up another longer legal fight to get underneath those black marks and figure out what the supporting material was that was taken out of the report.
We have another question now on Facebook from James Harvey Allen Enke asking, was there proof of collusion? Now, this is semantically a difficult area for the report because it does talk about this word collusion. Robert Mueller says collusion, although used colloquially in the same way as conspiracy, it's not in itself an actual crime. So the report didn't really deal with collusion, so to speak, which is a word we hear President Trump use all the time. It was looking at criminal conspiracy. And so when it came to the question of whether or not there was a criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russian officials or Russians ahead of the 2016 election, the report said there was insufficient evidence to say there was this sort of grand criminal conspiracy. But what the report did do, it did outline these numerous instances where there was contact between Trump campaign officials and Russians, and it highlights the fact that these Trump campaign officials knew that Russia's election interference efforts were geared towards helping the Trump campaign. In fact, in the Mueller report, it says that the Trump campaign believed it would benefit electorally from Russia's election interference. So it didn't meet the bar of a criminal conspiracy between the two, but certainly it highlighted the fact that there were these contacts. And one interesting period of questioning yesterday came during the House Intelligence Committee hearing, where the chairman of that committee, Adam Schiff, was asking Robert Mueller about the ethics of accepting help from a foreign government, and he got Robert Mueller to say that it is unethical to accept help from a foreign government, that it can leave someone vulnerable. And he said that Robert Mueller said that Donald Trump's behavior in this area, encouraging WikiLeaks, for example, to post Hillary Clinton's emails that were stolen by Russian hackers, was problematic. So it didn't go to that level, but there certainly was some of these contacts happening in the background.
Okay, here's my favorite question. It comes every Facebook Live. This is from Oil and Gas 007 on Twitter, and you're asking, why does this matter to me as a Canadian? And you are 100% absolutely right to ask that question because we're a public broadcaster and we're here to deliver news with a Canadian context. And this is an unprecedented story about American democracy. And it is important to understand the pressures on this administration because of the larger implications it has for all of the many kinds of partnerships that our country has with this president and with this administration. This is important context about a significant neighbor. It also talks about what foreign countries can do in an established democracy to get at the heart of those systems. And what we got from Robert Mueller's report and in his testimony, the parts that he was most animated about was the fact that the Russians, and other countries could do it too, took a functioning democracy and through both hacking and social media really was able to attempt to influence. We have no proof that it necessarily influenced the outcome, but what the Mueller report shows us is that those efforts can be taken. Folks were reading those Facebook messages and they didn't know they were talking to Russians, and then they went out and they started rallies, and they were communicating with people. And I think if you're watching this in Canada and you don't care about Donald Trump, and you don't care about what is going on at the committees or Robert Mueller, and you're sick of the fighting between the parties in this country, fair enough. But what your takeaway should be is that when you look at your Facebook account, to double check, to think about, does this make sense to me? And look at what happened in this election and the ramifications in terms of how it's divided people in this country, and let this be a lesson for how we go ahead in terms of understanding our own electoral process and how we communicate with each other in terms of a democracy. And that's the biggest takeaway for Canadians.
And just 2 more points on that. It's not just the report itself or Robert Mueller's testimony that talked about the vast, Robert Mueller used the word sweeping Russian election interference operation. There were several indictments throughout his investigation that went into great detail about what these Russian operatives did in terms of assuming American identities, posting on social media, as Lyndsay said. There were examples where these Russian operatives would plan a pro-Clinton rally and an anti-Clinton rally in the same place in the same day, all to sow political discord in the United States. So it's a fascinating look at how a country would do that. We obviously have our own election in Canada coming up in a few months, and the former American ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman, tweeted after the testimony yesterday, essentially saying, you know, as Lyndsay was saying, take a look at this. This is what can happen. So it obviously is an American story, but it's one that should concern all Western democracies that could be vulnerable to this.
Okay. So what is the likelihood that the president will be impeached? Do you want to take a go at that, Ellen?
I don't think it's very likely at all at this point. I think if Democrats were hoping that hearing from Robert Mueller would move the needle on the impeachment question, they're sorely disappointed. There was no shiny soundbite that can be repeated on cable news networks to sway minds that Donald Trump should be impeached. There is an element of the Democratic Party. There's 90 out of the 235 House Democrats support impeachment, but there obviously is a majority of Democrats who don't. Most Americans don't support impeachment, and we heard from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi yesterday after the hearings wrapped, and she seemed just as reluctant as she's ever been about actually pursuing the political process of impeachment. So I think it's highly unlikely. It's a difficult area for the Democrats because there is a more progressive wing that does want to see impeachment. It's a bit of an embarrassing divide for them. It makes things difficult. We've seen President Trump sort of capitalize on this big divide with Democrats, but I think it's incredibly unlikely that he will be impeached. And I think it comes down to a really shrewd political calculation on the part of the Democrats. What's a smart decision ahead of 2020? What's going to get you more voters? Most Americans don't want impeachment, and so Democrats, even if they feel like there's enough there to move ahead, they're not going to unless they think it's going to help them at the ballot box.
And the political calculation is that Democrats may have the votes to impeach in the House, but the ultimate decision about removal of office is in the Senate, and the Republicans have a majority in the Senate, and we have seen repeatedly that nothing that Republican lawmakers have seen in terms of the Mueller report, in terms of Donald Trump's other behaviors, which have also been raised as possibilities for an impeachment proceeding, none of those things have really flipped any of those Republicans. So the calculation for Democrats is, why go through this process? And Nancy Pelosi has said that it would divide the country and it's not worth it. If we look at what happened to the Bill Clinton impeachment proceedings, that really is a lesson, because he was impeached in the House, but when it got to the Senate, he was not voted out of office in that trial. And the consequence of that whole proceedings, as people watched it unfold, was Bill Clinton's popularity increased. People were sympathetic for, that the president was having to sort of undergo all of this. Very different substantive issues underlying these different presidents. However, the idea that what it would look like if we went into an impeachment hearing ahead of 2020 is that the Democrats were out to get this president, that they were trying to overturn a legitimate victory, which has already been a talking point for the president and for his supporters, then that keeps the focus on that in the election campaign, and it takes the focus away from what Democrats would like to talk about, which are the issues that brought out many voters in the 2018 election, which is about the things that matter to Americans perhaps more than the whole Mueller drama, which is, healthcare and maybe even family leave and other kinds of policy issues that bring out voters. And what we saw yesterday, if you are in the Trump camp or if you are in the Democrat camp, what you saw yesterday is not necessarily going to change your mind one way or the other. And people, I heard the phrase used, that they are calcified in their opinions heading to the elections in a year from November. The people that will make a difference, though, are the small number of people who could potentially be moderate voters that would swing from one way to the other. And what matters is where they are in terms of the states for the Electoral College. Many of those voters are suburban women who perhaps voted for Trump before, but who are considering or who would consider moving to a Democrat. They're not necessarily going to move towards a Democrat that is, very much pro-impeachment from the more progressive wing. In order to keep the House and to potentially get the presidency, Democrats need to have a platform and a policy that speaks to moderate voters that might be in the middle, that might not vote, or that would potentially still vote for Donald Trump. That's Pelosi's dilemma here in terms of keeping her caucus unified and together, and also in terms of the impeachment calculation.
And that is the problem for the Democrats, because you will have heard of Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, for example. Nancy Pelosi, as Lyndsay was saying, does have this very progressive wing, and the fear for more moderate Democrats looking ahead to 2020 is if they swing too far to the left, then they'd have no hope of getting those moderate voters. And that all works well into a question from Megan Green on YouTube. She is asking how Americans are reacting to this. Are they supporting the president?
I think that if they supported the president before yesterday, they're still in that camp. And if they didn't like the president, what Robert Mueller said yesterday would not change that one way or the other. I haven't seen any sort of quick polls in terms of where this sits, but Donald Trump's popularity numbers have sort of been steady, right? Like, he is in the low 40s, mid to low 40s in terms of his approval rating, with a disapproval in the low 50s, and that has maintained, even through the tweets, the accusation of racism, the center back chant, hasn't really rattled those numbers. So it shows just how entrenched Americans are in their opinions of the president. And with respect to re-election, it was maybe a month ago, I wrote an article about, what were his chances for re-election when he sort of officially relaunched his campaign. And, the smartest minds that I was able to talk to put it at 50-50 in terms of it being a toss-up, whether or not he'll be able to take the power of the incumbency, the strength of the economy, and really channel that into a victory that will depend, as his last victory did, really on the thinnest of margins.
And when Lyndsay was writing that article, we did a trip to southern Pennsylvania, Trump country. I went to a county there asking people on the day President Trump announced his re-election bid how they were feeling. And as Lyndsay was saying, strong Trump supporters remain strong Trump supporters. We were in a diner in the area, and we talked to a lot of voters who are happy with what he's doing with the economy. They like his tough talk on immigration. They like his tough talk with other partner countries when it comes to trade. So they're willing to look past the more controversial aspects that Lyndsay mentioned, because they like what he's doing otherwise. And support is strong. We were in this diner, we talked to a lot of people. There were a lot of people who didn't want to talk to us on camera, but they would shout, "Go Trump!" And I was driving through Maryland a few days ago. I saw a lot of cars with Trump bumper stickers. So I think, as Lyndsay was saying, if you go into any big day like yesterday, you're probably going to leave that day with the opinion you came into it with.
And the question here coming from the Lone Knight on YouTube is, what will it take for Republicans to stop protecting Trump. And, we have seen critics within the Republican Party, and they leave the Republican Party. The one critic who was a member of Congress who sort of wanted to stick to the Tea Party fiscal platform on which he entered politics is now sitting as an independent. The critics before the midterms, Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, they have retired. The Republican Party is the party of Donald Trump, and that has meant that a lot of Republicans are sort of reversing the principles by which they got elected, particularly on the whole idea of debt reduction and the fiscal stuff that we heard from the Tea Party election. If you look at a guy like Lyndsay Graham, he's had a complete reversal. You see the pictures of Ted Cruz, Lyndsay Graham, all of these Republicans who were so critical of Trump in the run-up to the 2016 election being fully on board right now. And a number of reasons for that could be the proximity to power. There is a power in the presidency, and if people want to get things done, there are tax cuts that have been popular. The economy is great, and politicians want to keep their jobs. And for those reasons, they are lining up behind Donald Trump, and there is really zero indication that is going to change.
And Lyndsay Graham, I think, is the best example when
Yeah.
you consider that before Donald Trump was president, Lyndsay Graham referred to him as a race-baiting, xenophobic bigot. And then a few weeks ago, after the Send Her Back chant at the Trump rally, where President Trump was also criticized for his tweets saying that for Democratic lawmakers, all American citizens, all women of color should go back to where they came from, essentially. Lyndsay Graham said that all of that wasn't racist. So that's a pretty stark example of the turn that we've seen from some Republican Party leaders.
CB Martinez is asking about the failing to initiate the impeachment process and saying, does it undermine the concept of the rule of law? What many Democrats who want to see an impeachment proceeding start, regardless of where it would go in the Senate, what they say is this undermines the Constitution, that the idea that a president should be impeached or could be impeached or that process exists was exactly to protect the way that this country is governed and run, that those proceedings were there so that the Constitution would be upheld, and so that there would not be an avenue whereby someone who is motivated by greed or corruption, not necessarily even crimes, like high crimes and misdemeanors doesn't necessarily mean you got to be charged with anything, but it's just an offense that is deemed to be not of the office. And what many Democrats are saying, the ones that would like to see impeachment start, is we have an obligation to uphold the Constitution regardless of the political calculation. What's interesting is that the lawmakers who are making these decisions are split, although it looks as though impeachment is less likely than likely, but the Democratic candidates for president, the just under 24 of them who are running, who want the job, they're saying that they believe that this president should be impeached. There should be a process started. It's a bit easier when that's the job that you're running for, and you're not trying to keep control of the House. But that's where we're hearing some of that sort of more obligation, high-minded understanding of how this country works. And there is a concern that the things that we're seeing with this presidency are throwing norms, away, and to an extent that it will be tough to get some of the respect for those processes back in future presidencies.
And Robert Mueller talked about new norms yesterday in his testimony, where he was asked by one lawmaker whether he fears that accepting a foreign government's help in an election could become a new norm, and he said that he fears that it could be. So that speaks to that.
And this is Brenda Mitchell on Facebook. She's asking us, Ellen, what toll does all of this take on Americans' belief in the whole democratic process? This is an interesting one because I think that Americans are exhausted. It is one thing to sort of take all of this information in, and remember, you're not taking this information in and trusting it, right? Like, so much of the information that people are getting is from sources that are one side or the other, and so you're having to, and you can't even believe what's popping up on your Facebook because it could be the Russians.
Yeah.
So at the same time, these institutions that are revered by Americans, the White House, Congress, the divides that exist within families, I think that a couple of things have happened. I think that this has forced partisan Americans into their corners, getting ready for a fight, and really looking ahead to the next election as either a way to keep the course that's going if you're a Republican who supports Donald Trump, or to have, as we've heard Joe Biden say before, like this is the last chance to try to turn this ship around and go back to a sense of normalcy. But then there are a lot of people who just want to wake up and have it be November, and who are not watching with every sort of nuance or every sort of tweet that perhaps they were a year ago, because not only is there's divisions within families, right? A lot of this is heartbreaking because of the criticisms of the president or the behavior of the president, depending on how you see it, is not how you grew up understanding what this country was to be, and it's such a huge part of the identity for so many people who live in this country is being challenged by the way all of this is playing out. And that was, probably the same evidence with how the hearing played out yesterday too.
Well, speaking of how the hearing played out, when you have someone like Robert Mueller, who served in Vietnam, is widely respected, an former FBI director, someone who's been awarded medals for his service to the country, he, by a few lawmakers yesterday, particularly Republican lawmakers, was treated in a somewhat disrespectful fashion, questioning his integrity. Some of the reactions and commentary on him afterwards was, probably more disrespectful than you would imagine would have been leveled in the past against someone widely seen as an American hero.
And that was one of the very first questions we had, was what did we learn that was new from the hearing? And in terms of the substantive stuff, not a whole heck of a lot. In terms of some of Mueller's explanations about the report, there was some new commentary there. But the one thing that really was new was that line of attack from several Republicans, which was to go after the motivation and the integrity of the investigator himself. It's exactly in line with what the president has said on Twitter, attacking Mueller and calling the whole thing a witch hunt. But the tone of some of those accusations about the decisions that Mueller made was a new tactic to sort of undermine the credibility of the whole report, and really does go to show the divide with which the politicians sort of view this. They do not agree on him being necessarily that arbiter of truth and the prosecutor who would really get to the bottom of things. It's amazing, if you contrast when Robert Mueller was appointed, and I remember I was standing outside because we couldn't get in here that night, and I was surrounded by people who were calling me, who were screaming at me that I was fake news, and I was having to say, oh, the special counsel has been appointed. But the report at that time was the universal respect that both Republicans and Democrats had for this former FBI director that would undertake this investigation. There was this Lyndsay Graham, as you mentioned, everyone seemed to think, okay, this is the guy who's going to get to the bottom of this. Different reaction from the president, according to the report, but that respect has eroded in these 2 years, and we saw that tactic by Republicans to go after some Republicans, not all of them, to go after the integrity and the motivations behind the report. We should also talk about too that the Republicans' attacks were familiar to many of the things that we have heard about Republicans or about the report, including accusations, as you mentioned, of bias. And there is another layer of investigation happening there with the Department of Justice in terms of the origins of this report and the FISA warrants that were issued for Carter Page and the Steele dossier, and all of that will be investigated in another forum. And not surprisingly, those questions about the origins of the investigation were put to Robert Mueller yesterday, and he largely deflected and didn't go anywhere near that. Although he did defend his lawyers, right?
He did. He said, there was a question of, are these lawyers, do they have a political bias? And Robert Mueller repeatedly said that wasn't what I was looking at. I was looking at people who could do the job well and with integrity. And as I was saying, this was widely seen as a bit of a lackluster, a little bit unanimated performance from Robert Mueller, but he did come to life when it came to questioning the integrity of his people that he hired. And just to go back to briefly Americans' belief in the democratic process as a whole, I think that's part of the reason too why people like Nancy Pelosi are reluctant to pursue impeachment, because it's just another layer another process that won't result in anything tangible. And I think they recognize the exhaustion with that. I mean, Donald Trump said that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, I forget the exact line, but they know that this is probably going to come down to the 2020 election.
Norman Soper is writing on Facebook. He's asking us, Ellen, why wouldn't Mueller answer 200 plus questions, and why didn't he pursue criminal actions against the perpetrator of the Steele dossier? On the Steele dossier and on why he wouldn't answer the 200 plus questions, those all fell into the category of things that we knew ahead of time that Robert Mueller would not speak about. He was going to speak to what was in the report. If we look back to May, when Robert Mueller held that press conference saying that the counsel had wrapped up, he really wanted that to be his one and only appearance. The report is my testimony. So, and on that, there was a letter from the Department of Justice. Mueller sought guidance on that in terms of, what could he answer, and he was going to stick to the four corners of the report. The places where he did deviate were to defend his lawyers, saying that he did not ask for people's political affiliations. That's just not the way that the Department of Justice worked, and the more heated and quite passionate comments about the Volume 1 of the Mueller report, which is the efforts by the Russians to interfere in the election, and also his classification of dealing with WikiLeaks as being unpatriotic, problematic. Really, he did take a step further and sort of qualify the behavior of Donald Trump through questioning and the relationship with that information without really commenting on any of the criminal possibilities.
And there were a lot of questions on the Steele dossier because that forms a lot of the basis of the president's argument that the origin of the probe was biased, that it was based on this dossier with
unverified allegations. The dossier was initially funded by an opponent in the primary, then connected to the Democratic campaign. So one of the issues for Republicans has been the funding of that information and how much the judges who were issuing these warrants to initiate knew about. I mean, a lot of those claims have been refuted. The warrants had to be re-upped several times, but those concerns remain, and they continue to be pursued by the Department of Justice under William Barr.
But they also somewhat overlook in a way what's more likely the origin of the investigation, which is when a Trump campaign aide, George Papadopoulos, was drinking at a bar in London, speaking to an Australian diplomat and saying that he knew the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton, and we know that was then flagged by the Australians to the FBI.
Yeah, so anyway, I think we are. Do you have anything else you want to say?
Just that, keep watching this space, this story. I mean, as much as impeachment isn't likely to happen, politicking around it is going to continue, and it's going to continue to be perhaps more difficult for the Democrats keeping themselves together than it will be for President Trump. But he's going to use that, obviously, in his own campaigning ahead of 2020.
And if you really do care about this, and you really want to know what Robert Mueller said and how it's being interpreted, pick up the report. I was just in an airport in Saskatoon, and there it was on the bestseller list. We're here to help you sort of understand the testimony, but if you want to, that's the horse, that's the mouth. It is fascinating to look at the extent of the efforts that were made, the legal arguments, whether you agree with them or not, and especially that first volume in terms of the efforts that were undertaken to undermine the 2016 election. It's jaw-dropping in terms of the fact that Russians were traveling here. They were talking to people in politics. They were trying to really sow discord. Initially, they just wanted to sow discord, and then they realized that Trump was their guy. And if this whole thing tells us anything, it's just to, be careful of what you see here, eh?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
fake news.
Okay. On that note, we're out of here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.